back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and this is 10 cards you should be putting in your Commander decks, episode 50. And we are starting out this time with Paradox Haze. 2 and a blue enchantment aura. Enchant player. At the beginning of enchanted player's first upkeep, each turn that player gets an additional upkeep step after this step. So I know a lot of people probably know this card exists already. I gotta give it a mention though, because it is just such a crucial card in Commander, because it's the only card that does this, and it is an absolute auto-include in so many different decks, I think. First of all, I'll just say you can use this on your opponents if you want to. If there's a reason to, you can give your opponent an extra upkeep. However, I'm going to go over the commanders where you're going to be wanting to use this on yourself. Let's start with Zedruu the Great-Hearted, right? At the beginning of your upkeep, you gain X life and draw X cards, where X is the number of permanents you own that your opponents control. So how about we do that twice, right? We're going to get 2 upkeeps, so that ability is going to trigger twice. We're going to get to gain X life and draw X cards twice. Scarab God, at the beginning of your upkeep, each opponent loses X life and you scry X, where X is the number of zombies you control. That's a pretty fantastic trigger that we wouldn't mind getting 2 times every turn. Taigam Sidisi's Hand, at the beginning of your upkeep, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. That'd be a great thing to do twice. How about Lindy Cheerful Tormentor? Here's a new one. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may attach a curse attached to you to one of your opponents. If you do, draw 2 cards. So now again, we can do that twice on our turn if we want. Both Xanathar and Sen triplets, it's particularly good in because they have the at the beginning of your upkeep choose an opponent, so we can do that twice. Now we get to choose 2 opponents, and we can play 2 different opponents' cards, and they can't cast spells. So I think it's an auto include in both of those decks. So again, I'm sure that most people know this card exists, but I'm just throwing it out there because it is just so important, I think, in so many decks. And a lot of people might not be playing it, and they should. Coming in at number 2 is Parallel Evolution. 3 green sorcery. For each creature token on the battlefield, its controller creates a token that's a copy of that creature and has flashback for green. So the obvious comparison here is Second Harvest. Second Harvest is one I think most people are aware of. They use in a lot of token doubling type of decks, the Adrix and Nev decks maybe. Any deck where you're creating tokens like an Arasta deck, something like that. Parallel Evolution is another option there. Another option that maybe a lot of people don't know exists. The only downside here is that everyone gets to use this, right? For each creature token on the battlefield, its controller creates another one. So your opponents will get to use it as well. I don't think that's a big deal though. This is only creature tokens. It's not going to affect treasures or anything like that. So your opponents aren't going to get anything out of this unless they have creature tokens in play. And you're probably going to have a ton, right? The deck you're putting this into is going to have a whole bunch. So there's no way your opponents are going to take more advantage of this than you are. And if they do, you're just not going to cast it. Obviously, you're going to wait for the right moment for this. And then it also has flashback, right? So it's just nice to have another option for that kind of thing. Coming in at number 3, Peace Talks. This is such an interesting card. 1 and a white sorcery. This turn and next turn, creatures can't attack, and players and permanents can't be the target of spells or activated abilities. So obviously this card probably works better in a 2-person format than in a multiplayer format. What makes this card interesting is that you're going to cast it likely on your turn. It's a sorcery, but you can do all this stuff before you cast it, right? So on your first main phase, you can cast a bunch of stuff, then you can attack, and then on your second main phase, you cast this, and you don't really care about the outcome because you've already done all the stuff you want to do. And then on the next turn, that person can attack, and players and permanents can't be the target of spells or activated abilities. Is a pretty interesting card. Coming in at number 4, Pedantic Learning. 2 and a blue enchantment. Whenever a land card is put into your graveyard from your library, you may pay 1. If you do, draw a card. So I've mentioned this card a few times on my channel. I thought it was a great fit with a Sidisi deck because you are milling yourself, right? Any self-mill strategy in blue, it's going to be great because whenever those lands hit your graveyard from your library, you can pay 1 and draw a card. If you mill 3 lands, you can pay 3 and draw 3 cards. In that Slogurk deck I made, I thought it was a good fit there. Again, if you're milling yourself, which is what I did in that deck. My Nimrus deck, I had put that in there as well because you're not milling yourself there, but the cards are going from your library into your graveyard, right? They're not going in any other zone. You're looking at the top cards of your library and then you're putting them into your graveyard. So if you happen to put any land cards into your graveyard when you do that ability of your commanders, you can again pay and draw a card. And of course, I had just recently mentioned this card when I was talking about Kyrie the Swirling Sky. because it has that mill ability on it, right? When it dies, you can mill 6 cards, then return up to 2 instant or sorcery cards from your graveyard to your hand. So when you mill 6, guaranteed you're going to be hitting a couple lands there. So this could be another good include if you're thinking of building that deck as well. Just a really unique card in what it's doing, and I think it could fit in a bunch of decks. Coming in at number 5. Pendlehaven Elder, 1 and a green, elf shaman, 1/1. Tap, each 1/1 creature you control gets +1/+2 until end of turn. So this is a really interesting card. Again, I think there's a fair amount of people that know this exists, but it probably should see a lot more play than it does. What's important with Pendlehaven Elder is each 1/1 creature you control gets +1/+2 until end of turn. So this pumps your whole team. So if you're in any theme where you're making lots of 1/1 creatures, this is pretty fantastic. So like that squirrel tribal deck, like Chatterfang, right? You're going to be creating all those 1/1 squirrels. Why not turn them into 2/3s? How about that Beladros deck, right? You're going to be cranking out those pest tokens. Why not turn them all into 2/3s? Hapatra is making those snake tokens that you can turn all into 2/3s. There's a lot of commanders out there in green cranking out 1/1 tokens, so I think this card probably should see a lot more play. It is currently only in 145 decks on EDH Rec. I almost fell over when I read that. There is, by my quick search, 36 legendary creatures in green that are creating 1/1s. So this card should see a heck of a lot more play. Speaking of making those little 1/1 creatures, a great way to use them is with Perilous Forays. 3 green enchantment. 1 mana, sacrifice a creature, search your library for a basic land card with a basic land type and put it into play, tap, then shuffle. This is a card that I used to see a lot more back in the day when I first started playing. It's a decent sack outlet for green. Really great in those Omnath Locus of Rage decks, right? Because you can sacrifice that elemental token. It's going to do damage. Then you just go get a land, make another elemental token, right? So for every 1 mana you have, you're dealing 3 damage. And getting another landfall trigger if you have other landfall effects in play. Also, for the same reason, Maya Bredegard Protector just seems like an auto-include there as well, because for every 1 mana, you're sacrificing one of your tokens that you're making, getting a land, replacing the token. So basically, for every 1 mana you have, you can go get a basic land out of your library and put it directly into play. It can also be a fantastic fit in a Phylath World Sculptor deck, because again, you're making the tokens and also have a landfall theme. It works a little bit differently there, but you're going to get all those 0/1 plant creature tokens for each basic land you control, and then you can sack those plant tokens to go get more lands, and then those lands are going to put 4 +1/+1 counters on a plant that you control that you still have kicking around. So again, this card is in a decent amount of decks, but I think it should be in a lot more for sure. Coming in at number 7, Phyrexian Portal. This is such an interesting card. 3 mana artifact. You can pay 3. If your library has 10 or more cards in it, target opponent looks at the top 10 cards of your library and separates them into 2 face-down piles. Exile one of those piles, right? So you're going to choose a pile to exile. The piles are face down. You don't know what's in them. So right out of the gate, this is just such a fun, interesting card because it's sort of a guessing game. You're just like with Gifts Ungiven, right? Gifts Ungiven is one of my favorite cards. I think it's one of the greatest cards ever made because of the really fun interaction between the 2 players that are involved. Even more so, I think, with Gifts Ungiven, because you have to sort of think about what your opponent's going to do and you make your decisions based on that. This is going to be the same way. Whatever opponent is doing this, they have to think, okay, well, what pile is he going to pick? Maybe I'll make a really small pile with stuff that he wants in it and then a bigger pile with stuff he doesn't want, but then maybe he'll figure out that that's what I'm doing, so maybe I'll do it in reverse. You know, there's some mind games involved, which I think is pretty interesting. So you exile one of the piles, and then the other pile, you're going to search that pile for a card. So you're just going to take any card out of that pile and put it into your hand. So the ultimate resolution here is that you're paying 3 mana to put a card into your hand. But this is a considerable amount better than pay 3 mana, draw a card, I think. And also I like the fun aspect of it, and also the politics aspect of it, of course, as well, where you can pick the opponent that wants to give you the stuff, right? There's always going to be that scenario where someone's got a really horrible creature or something on the board, and so they put all the removal into one pile or something like that so that you can get a removal spell out of it. I think it's pretty decent in a commander game, and also really fun. And while we're on the topic of really funny, interesting, wacky cards, Piracy, and this is such a funny card. I saw it and I was just like, should I talk about this in my 10 cards video? I actually had a discussion with one of my patrons about whether or not I should talk about it. I ultimately thought I would because it is very unique. It's 2 blue sorcery. Until end of turn, you may tap lands you don't control for mana. Spend this mana only to cast spells. Just such a funny card, and I actually think it's usable in a commander game. First of all, I'll say this. I had a patron a little while ago ask me to make a patron deck tech for them, and it was for Two-Headed Giant. They had a partner, and their partner was playing a particular deck, and they wanted to play a Pure and Toothy deck that would fit with the deck that their Two-Headed Giant partner was playing with, right? There are other ways to play this format, obviously, and I think this is actually a good fit there, right? Because until end of turn, you may tap lands you don't control for mana. So now I can cast this, and in the Pure and Toothy deck, this will fit. So now my partner can leave mana up that I can use to cast stuff on my turn. So it actually does work there. Now, again, you can use this in a politics way, right? Cards like this used to be a lot better. For those who don't know, you're wondering why would they ever print a card like this? Pygmy Hippo is another funny, interesting card from the back in the day that sort of is in a similar thread where you could use your opponent's lands to pay for stuff, but doesn't really work anymore because your opponents can just tap their lands in response, right? People will look at this card and say, oh, that's terrible because your opponents will just tap all their lands down in response to this and then you can't use it. Used to be there was mana burn, right? If you did that back in the day, tap down your lands, you would have to eat all that damage. Obviously, that's not the case anymore, so cards like this got way worse. But I will just say this. If your opponents tap all their lands down, they just tapped all their lands down. That's not bad, right? They can't counter your stuff, so there's that. So that is a little bit of an advantage onto itself. But obviously where I think this card actually does work in a commander game is in the political way. Even if you don't have that Two-Headed Giant scenario, this can be used in a political way where you make a deal with one of you. Hey, can you help me get my commander? My commander's really expensive. I'm playing Chromium, right? And it's not a threatening commander. It's just a funny old interesting commander that costs 8 mana. I'll make a deal with you, right? I'll let you draw a card off my Baleful Mastery or something like that if you let me tap a couple of your lands in order to cast my commander. So that's where I think this card actually can be pretty good, right? If I'm playing a Chromium or something like that, and I have this really expensive commander that, maybe in a fun casual game, my opponents will actually be glad to give me some of their mana in order to cast my fun old janky commander. Coming in at number 9 is Plagiarize. 3 and a blue instant. Until end of turn, if target player would draw a card, instead that player skips that draw and you draw a card. I'm really surprised I never see this in Commander. I think it's pretty good. The art is just out of this world. I just think the art is super crazy. It's sort of a one-shot Notion Thief effect, right? And typically a Notion Thief is a one-shot effect, right? Typically with a Notion Thief, somebody's going to flash it in response to their opponent playing a giant draw spell or something, or maybe a wheel, and then get the effect off of it. And then after it sits in play, it just acts as a preventative. Your opponents aren't going to draw a bunch of cards when you have a Notion Thief in play, right? They're just not going to do it. So this is not as good, but it's almost as good because the one-shot effect is going to be probably the most effective way to use it anyway, right? It only hits one player. So again, not quite as good as the Notion Thief play. But I mean, in the wheel scenario, whether it be you casting the wheel or an opponent, in response to the wheel, you point this at the guy that you really don't like and don't want him to have any cards. And now he will discard his whole hand and draw nothing, and you will draw 14 cards. I just am really surprised I don't see this card more. There is lots of those big, I draw a whole bunch of cards all at once plays in every game has it, right? Every game you have an opponent who is going to be drawing like 4, 5, 6 cards all at once. Rishkar's Expertise, something like that. That happens in every game, right? Pretty great card in a Commander game, I think. And coming in at number 10 this week is Plague Boiler, 3 mana artifact. At the beginning of your upkeep, put a plague counter on Plague Boiler. Pay 1 black and a green, put a plague counter on Plague Boiler, or remove a plague counter from it. When Plague Boiler has 3 or more plague counters on it, sacrifice it. If you do, destroy all non-land permanents. Man, I love this card. I've loved it ever since it originally came out in Ravnica. I just thought it was so fun and interesting. They did actually reprint this in a Commander set, Commander 2013, because they thought this would be a great card in a Commander game. Didn't really see much play. I never see it in a commander game. I used to have it in a Glissa the Traitor deck that I had because it's an artifact that's going to eventually go to the graveyard that you can then get back. So I thought it was a great fit there. I just think it's a great card all around. I mean, you're going to play it at the beginning of your next upkeep. You put a plague counter on it. You don't have to wait. I mean, if you have the mana up, you can immediately put 3 plague counters on this. I mean, it's a lot. It's going to be 3 mana to cast and then another 9 mana to put counters on it. So 12 mana total to wipe the whole board if you want to do it right away. But the great part about it is you can add play counters or remove them. So you can really get into a fantastic politics situation here, I think, where depending on the board state, you know, oh, I'm about to make this go off, but my opponent just cast a Wrath of God anyway, so yeah, maybe I'll wait. You know, I'll remove a counter so that on my upkeep, it goes back up to 2 instead of going to 3. Maybe you can do some wheeling and dealing with your opponents where they don't want their board wiped, so they're not going to attack you. You know, you can use it as a sort of a standoff scenario with your opponents. It just can be great that way. Obviously, it's got those black and green pips, so your deck has to be black and green in order to use it. That hurts it a little bit, I think. I just still think it's a really great card in a commander game. And there is lots of ways, other than this, its own ability, there is other ways to manipulate the counters on it as well, of course. So give it a try if you want, but that is it for today. That is 10 more cards you should be putting in your commander decks. I have now recommended 500 cards for you guys. And if you are thinking of purchasing any of these cards, please use my TCG Player link. It is in the description below. It helps support the channel. That is it for today, and thanks for tuning in.